So with Second Life, we kind of close a whole bunch of the loops of things that we're going to be talking about, and that's basically the bulk of the talk here. So Second Life launched in 2003, and this picture is sort of indicative because, so this is the inside of a dance club, one of the more popular things to create in Second Life, and there are a whole bunch of people dancing, including a duck with a monkey on its back. And this is the kind of cultural collisions you constantly get in Second Life because there really aren't any rules. Build whatever you want, create whatever you want. We didn't build in turntables, we didn't build in clubs. Users just figured out that they could make those things. So why did that evolve now as opposed to off of any of those other tendrils? It's basically the collision of consumer broadband, lots of good routing infrastructure during the boom, and 3D. What that allows us to do is to stream everything down. So like we're seeing right now, all the content's being streamed down to us in as close to real time as possible. And we're also running a distributed grid of computers, and we'll look at that in a moment. The fact that we're running this big grid and letting people come onto it, and the land has value because we use it as a proxy for CPU usage, means that people sort of have a choice of how much they want to pay us. So we have lots of people who pay us nothing. And our top user, in terms of payment, who's actually German, interestingly enough, pays us about $16,000 a month to own land in a virtual world. Perhaps more interesting is she's very cash flow positive. So she's making a huge profit doing that. And she's doing that by being a landlord, by being a land speculator, by creating, for example, German communities within Second Life. So for German speakers being able to find each other, because there are about 1,000 German residents using Second Life right now. So this is sort of the growth of the world. We launched in June 2003 with our 16 one-use servers, and we're at about 1,800 CPUs today. So we're a fairly decent-sized grid, and that grid just continues to grow with user acquisition. So we're doing full rigid body dynamics, and as well as a bunch of CA-based and fluid simulation on a space of about 115 square kilometers. So that's twice as big as my home city of San Francisco, tiny compared to Berlin, which is gymongous. But what's neat about our topology and our architecture is as we gain more users and need more space, we just plug in more computers. And so this grid is just continuing to grow as we need to grow it. So if you do the math, we're at teraflops of physical simulation. About, we haven't done the supercomputer test yet because we can't take ourselves down long enough to run LINPACK, but we're kind of excited to do that because we think we'll make it onto the list, which would be really cool. And obviously we're doing rigid body dynamics, we're doing Navier-Stokes for clouds and wind and things like that. This is all important because this provides a world then that when people say, hey, I want to do something, it's probably going to just work because all of the building blocks are there. So we just crossed 100,000 residents, so we're not as mainstream as some, but at 100,000 worldwide, that's a fairly major number, and at 20% a month, that's nice growth that we're very happy about. More interesting, perhaps, is our demographics. Games tend to skew toward 18-year-old boys. Second Life skews toward a much older and much more gender-balanced audience. Most interestingly is that by hours of use, we're about 50-50 men and women. And along any axis that you want to measure best, whether it's richest, most land ownership, most friends, most social contacts, all of the top users are women. So women run our world. And the median age is 35, so we skew quite a bit older as well. And what we're seeing is people bringing their real world skills into Second Life and using them there as well. So, and again, just to give you sort of an idea of scope, about 50,000 people use Second Life in the last 30 days. So 180,000 different items were bought or traded between residents. So 180,000, I mean, that's a lot of different things. And that was in 4.8 million player-to-player transactions. So they're making a lot of different things, and those things clearly have value because measured by the internal currency, there's a value of about 4.5 million US during that month, and 400,000 of that was traded on open markets for real US dollars. Right, so $400,000 between 50,000 people in a month. And there were 75 million IM messages because people obviously like to talk to each other. So how do we achieve all of that creativity and creation? Well, you can do the math probably better than I can, but when you have 60,000 user hours a day and a quarter of that time is spent making something, it's like I had a 2,700 person content development team. which if I had to pay them, it would be $270 million a year, which clearly I'm not doing. Instead, they're paying me to use Second Life, well, paying us. So I have more people writing script code than Debian has contributors. So it's interesting because we plug into a lot of the same community aspects that open source is so successfully leveraged, but we allow people who don't know how to write code to still contribute and participate. And that's been really exciting to watch and really exciting to talk to our residents about. And so remember this whole ownership status quo, games don't let you own anything. Second Life obviously is different. We do let people own what they make. We do grant people rights to what they own. So they have their IP rights. And there's a whole separate argument about whether digital items should be intellectual property. The perhaps unfortunate reality is that currently in US and European law it is, so we can have that discussion separately if anybody wants to. We also allow people to obviously buy and sell for real US, or for real money, which again is very different than most of the games. And in fact, we've already seen some examples of people licensing their content back into the real world, and we'll talk about some of those examples. So what's all this about an inevitable transformation, right? Well, we've already seen on the net that there's this clearly an ability for radical decentralization to allow a lot of creation, right? The net's really big. And all of this was enabled by saying, look, here's some basic protocols, go to town, we're going to let you go do what you want, we're not going to try to govern this. There isn't going to be some massive central authority stopping all this. And obviously there's value both in the creation itself and in the networks that are being created. But where it gets interesting is what happens when you take that same sort of power and say, okay, let's move out of just text, let's move into 3D, into experiences, into everything that you can do in a virtual world, and let's make it all real time. So we introduced the concept of sort of atomistic construction. So of course, people make guns. They go into a virtual world, and one of the first things they make is guns. That's probably a sad commentary on the human existence. But I don't know if you can see it clearly, but that gun's actually broken into about 40 primitives. So individual small objects that were manipulated in real time. So when the guy who was building this gun was doing it, someone else could have been helping and standing nearby and saying, hey, do you want this texture, or maybe you want this script? And this gun sells for about $4 US, just to give you a kind of an equivalent. And the person who made it's a grad student actually in computer science, and it hasn't paid his tuition yet, but it's covered his books and his beer, which for a grad student can be pretty significant. So again, to differentiate this from sort of the places that have come before, in the game Ultima Online, this is how you made a piano. You took all of these random things, and I don't know if you can see it clearly, but it's a checkerboard and shirts, and you kind of stack them. And you end up with something that sort of kind of looks like a piano, right? And so this was a piano in Ultima Online because people wanted the decoration of a piano. But this has very few of the signal characteristics of a piano. It only has the appearance. So one of our Second Life residents made a piano in Second Life, and of course, you can actually play it. Every one of the keys actually plays a sampled real piano sound. So you could use this piano to entertain at a party, you could compose a symphony on it, you can use it for all the things you could use a piano for. You could even have a sexy avatar draped across it if that's sort of your fancy. So this is a really big difference. This is creation versus sort of crafting, which was the traditional game version of this. And what's interesting, and what everybody told us sort of 4 years ago, was that, well, these are really hard problems. People can't make 3D objects. People can't make good-looking people. And people definitely can't write code, right? These are some of the most traditionally hard problems in building interactive experiences. And just to give you some orders of numbers, right? So there are around 100 million 3D objects that residents have made up to date. They've made about 10 million different characters, avatars. There are like 30 million lines of script code that have been written, and about 10 terabytes of user content total. The nota bene is kind of cool in the bottom right. It's a resident who noticed that there was no notary in Second Life, and you'll probably at some point, when you're thinking about this, start asking questions like, well, is there government, and how do you do that? And obviously, we're not going to be doing top-down governance, so what's happening is the residents are trying to create themselves. And so one of the things they did is he recognized that you can't have, for example, mediation or dispute resolution if you can't prove what the agreement was. And so using our scripting language, he did secure key signing. Of course, our scripting language didn't actually run fast. It took like 7 minutes for it to process, to sign it. So then he switched to transmitting the data out of Second Life to his own computer, signing it there, and then transmitting the data back in. Because we allow a lot of connections back and forth to the real world. We, of course, hired him almost immediately. One of the great things about having a world where people write code is it's a great testing ground for potential hires. So basically what we've seen is if you give people these tools, they're going to go do all sorts of crazy stuff. Now, all sorts of crazy stuff inevitably includes unanticipated consequences. So these two guys decided that Second Life, like any world, clearly needed alien abductions. So they made these two aliens in a spaceship, and they started flying around and abducting avatars. And they were really clever about it, because what they did is they'd only do it about once a week for a while. And so you'd have these people posting in the forums, "I was abducted by aliens." And of course everybody's responding, "No, no, no, you're just stressed," And clearly you need to get more sleep. And so it was great too, because they gave you a T-shirt. I was abducted by aliens and anally probed, and all I got was this lousy T-shirt. And so these are the kind of things where there's no way a priori you're going to decide that your world needs something like this. And when you look at the evolution of the web, it's full of these moments. And when you look at Second Life, it's the same thing. It's occasionally rather terrifying to be on our side of all of those, and we'll actually look at one of the more destructive ones. So let's look at how user creation has hit all of these different areas. We've seen a lot of what I'd call traditional media imported into Second Life. So like the Metaverse Messenger, they actually do this gorgeous layout in a PDF file. And we tend to print them out and leave them around the office because it's just a beautifully laid out newspaper. The Second Life Herald is kind of fun. It's a philosophy professor from University of Michigan who, his idea of role-playing is to role-play as a curmudgeonly sort of yellow journalist, right? So muckraking, making up stuff. He would claim to not make up stuff, but he makes up stuff, right? And that's sort of his role-playing. And so he's constantly doing these incredibly incendiary articles and accusing us of stuff, and that's sort of his role. And he's actually got kicked out of a different online game for doing the same thing. And in Second Life, there are definitely days that it's not my favorite thing in the world to read what Peter's writing about me, but for the most part, it's pretty funny. And that's his method of playing. That's his method of enjoying the world. And the New World Notes is a blog. We have an embedded journalist who's been with us since very, very early on. And he basically writes as if he was writing for sort of a small town newspaper. And it's kind of interesting to see as we get to 100,000 residents, the number of real news stories has gone up a lot. There's a lot of very interesting news happening just among our residents. So a different form of communication, memorials. The upper left was for the London bombings. And this was an international group of residents came together immediately and wanted to do that. The bottom right was for Katrina after it hit New Orleans. And this is something that we've seen in Second Life. Other online worlds have seen this as well. What makes Second Life unique is the ability for people to really to explore what a memorial means and to make it whatever they want it to be, to not be limited by sort of the rules of the game. A small aside, so games have a concept traditionally of the magic circle. The best example of it would be hockey. So when you're playing hockey, you're allowed to hit people and knock them over and get in fights. Behavior that in the real world would be assault, battery, get you locked up in the pokey. But the courts have traditionally respected the fact that if you stay within the rules of the game or the rules of hockey, they're going to say, no, 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 you're just playing the game and everybody agreed and it was consent and da-da-da-da-da. So there's a big debate among games and online worlds about whether they should be connected to the real world. And one of the things we've seen with Second Life is, so all games have seen that no matter how much developers try to not connect them to the real world, everybody does. Because at the very least you have a communication connection and there's usually also an economic connection. What we've seen in Second Life is by actually encouraging this connection, people doing all sorts of really crazy stuff. So the upper left was the Second Life Community Convention. This was a group of users that in 12, I think it's 12 weeks